Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for the Teen Anxiety Maze this week. This week, I have a fun guest for us, Dr. Matthew Bernstein, and he is a clinical psychiatrist with more than 20 years of experience. And he's also the CEO of Accord, which we're going to talk about all that here in just a little bit. But he is one of the leading voices in metabolic psychiatry. So, this is something new for me. I didn't know a lot about, and you're going to find out about it today. And as parents, this is such important information because we can help our child's mental health by how they eat and their nutrition. So, and many other things. So, we're going to talk about all that. So, do you go by Matthew or Matt?
Call me Matt. That's great.
Oh, all right. All right. Well, Matt, it is so good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Wonderful. Well, can you tell us what is metabolic psychiatry? Like, I don't think a lot of people know what that is.
Well, it's new, so I'm sure a lot of people don't, but people will be hearing about it more over the next few years because there's a tremendous amount of research happening on this topic in big universities. And when those studies get published, we're going to have it in the news and people are going to
Mm.
be talking about it. So I think it's a little bit of a sneak peek of some of where the field of psychiatry is going in the next few years. And it's really this idea that our brain is part of the body, it's not a whole separate thing. And everything in the body is subject to metabolic processes. Metabolism is this idea of taking nutrients and turning them into energy, but also turning it into molecules that our cells need to do their function. So turning it into hormones and proteins and enzymes and neurotransmitters. Metabolism is all of that.
Mm.
And the brain is the most energy hungry organ in the body. It's only about 2% of the weight of the body, but uses somewhere around 20% of the energy throughout the day. So it's most sensitive to problems in metabolism of any organ. And so we're finding that when people are, that there's a bidirectional correlation between metabolic health and brain health or mental health. And so that's
Mm.
the idea is that if we can intervene, psychiatry is so focused on intervening on the brain, but actually if we intervene on the metabolism, that improves the brain health. And there's a long history behind all of this, which we can get into.
Oh my gosh. Well, so when you talk about metabolism, I just think about food or nutrition, but
Right.
you're probably also talking about sleep and other things that go along that are connected to our metabolism. Is that right?
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, nutrition is very powerful for metabolism, but so is exercise. We change our metabolism every time we move our body, and sleep also affects metabolism
Mm.
and circadian rhythm alignment, which is even a little more, advanced than just thinking about sleep, but it really helps with sleep. And then even
Hmm.
things like mind body relaxation practices, meditation, breathing exercises, yoga, that affects metabolism as well because it affects the mitochondria, which are these incredible organelles that are in all of our cells that are sort of at the center of this whole story about metabolism.
Mm. That is, I can really geek out on some of that kind of stuff. I love science and how all that stuff works. Well, you have an interesting story about why this is important to you. So, how did you even get into this metabolic psychiatry?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long story. I'm not going to tell the full long story version, but I've always had an open mind as a psychiatrist, trying to think of all the ways that, I can help my clients and my individuals. But my mind really opened up when two of our three children got very sick about 8 years ago. And they were very happy, well-adjusted kids at the time, aged 12 and 14. And we have three boys. They were doing well at school and sports and music and friends and all this stuff. And literally overnight, two of my three sons came down with tremendous anxiety and depression to the point where they literally could not go to school. They could not see their friends. They could not function in all the normal ways. They couldn't think the way they used to. They couldn't perform, they couldn't read. I mean,
Mm.
almost anything that they used to do, they couldn't do. And it was very all of a sudden. And, cut to the chase, it took a couple of years to figure out that it looked very psychiatric and we were doing a lot of psychiatric treatments. Turns out that it was a form of autoimmune disease called autoimmune encephalitis, essentially where the immune cells attack parts of the brain. There's a diagnosis called PANS that is all about infections leading to autoimmune processes. And that's what they had. And it took a couple of more years to get adequate treatment for that. They had a really, really severe case of this. And eventually, we did get adequate treatment, but it really opened my mind as a clinician, as in my professional life, that it's not all about neurotransmitters. It's not all about, psychotherapy and talking, that, you know, what's going on in the rest of the body really matters to the brain.
Mhm.
So I had that open mind, my mind open to this concept of, connecting body and brain. And then, there's been more and more published about the power of metabolism specifically for mental health. And I found that that's really, one of the best ways to intervene, to really think about the whole body and the whole person in a
Mm.
medical way.
This makes me think about a student I had years ago she was cutting herself, and I don't think she was suicidal, but she was very depressed. And the cutting was just a way for her to release all these emotions and terrible feelings she had inside. And I remember calling her parents and telling them, this is happening and you need to seek treatment. And a lot of families are reluctant to do mental health treatment. And so this family said, well, we'd like to go to our physician first. And I said, well, that's totally fine. Just make sure you tell them these things so that they can help you make a good decision as a family. And she had a thyroid
Mm,
disorder.
right.
And as soon as they got her on medication to regulate her thyroid, all of that went away.
Mm,
And that was my first experience and now that would be a medication type thing, not kind of like what you're talking about. But at the same time, I would have never guessed in a million years that that had anything to do with a physical problem. I thought her brain isn't working correctly, or she doesn't have enough anything to like feel better, or, she has too much anxiety or whatever it was. And that was my first, like, oh my gosh. And I really started talking to parents more about, at least talk to your doctor, your physical general practitioner doctor too, because there's so many ways that these things can be connected that we didn't even know about before. So that's kind of similar in a way. I mean, she probably maybe could have done different with her food too, and I don't know if that ever happened. But
I mean, that's a
so
very
I think it's
important
similar.
story and a very important
Mhm.
concept for your listeners, that, and bravo for those parents to go to their primary
Mhm.
care, and bravo for that primary care doctor to do a medical workup. And they were lucky that it was something that was easily caught on a regular lab panel.
Yes.
And I think the problem, though, is that there's so many things that can be going on that wouldn't be picked up on a standard lab panel at the primary care doctor's office or the pediatrician's office. And then the message back to the family is, you're medically fine, this is psychiatric, or this is mental health.
Mhm.
When again, we're dividing these things up that shouldn't be divided up. And then at the
Mhm.
mental health clinic, they're not going to be thinking about all these potential physical things. They're just going to be focusing on psychotherapy and neurotransmitters. And that's a very
Mhm.
narrow view of what could be going on with someone. And so, I mean, that's my biggest message to your listeners is, don't let the system turn it into this narrow focus. That, it's important as parents and individuals to think broadly about all the things that might be going on and all the things that might be able to help.
Well, I was going to say, what should the parents be doing then? What should they look at first, or what are some things they could try at home, or who should they be talking to get this real information?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, there are practitioners out there that are looking for root causes of things. There's this whole functional medicine world, and there are people probably in almost every community who are doing that kind of work, or they can be found online. So if someone
Mhm.
really thinks that, hey, this may, the doctors are calling this depression or anxiety, but I think there's something physical going on. I want to try to get to the root cause of that. There are people out there who are, able to work with families to look into, really look more in depth at much more extensive lab work and examinations of what's going on to try to find what the root causes might be. And that's in the end what we ended up doing with our kids. That's how we got to the root causes and got to solutions. that we were not getting with the best mental health care that we could find. And, we were finding expert people, but, the standard approaches just were not working. So
Mm,
that's a very important message, I think. But the other message is that sometimes we can look for all kinds of root causes and we can't find them, or it's too expensive to look at all these root causes
hmm.
because it's not often covered by insurance, a lot of that kind of work.
Yes.
And so, thinking about the things that might work for almost anything, is also another way to think about this. And that's almost, partly how I got into, eventually landing on focusing on metabolism because it's so powerful. It can do
Hmm.
so much for the brain and for the rest of the body to really focus on really good nutrition and sleep and exercise. As a doctor, we get trained that, being a doctor is to do these things that only doctors can do, prescribe medications, do surgery, and that's how kind of our whole culture thinks about it. And we sort of neglect the power of these other interventions, which are
Hmm.
truly amazingly powerful when done in the right way. And these things don't have to cost a lot of money. With a
Hmm.
little bit of information, someone can completely clean up their diet and have an incredible response to almost any of these types of situations that
Hmm.
involve brain health. So I think that's a hopeful message that yes, it can get very, very complicated, but we can try to simplify and come up with some things that can be universally helpful for people.
Yeah. Do you have a specific diet or do you have some way that something that people could look at to say this is how we should start at home looking at diet and sleep and what are some things that we could do to make it better?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of the things I'm going to say are things that people have heard before. So forgive me for that. But really it is some of the things that we already know. We know that all of these processed foods with that are laden with sugar and high carb, simple carbohydrates and industrial oils and a bunch of chemicals that are really, man-made in a lab that are probably
Hmm.
not things we should be putting into our bodies 3 or 4 times a day. And yet
Hmm.
that is exactly what is going on in,
Hmm.
most, you know, schools and unfortunately in many homes as well, because
Hmm.
we're all so busy and we sort of bought into this food system that,
Hmm.
we go to the grocery store, not 90% of the stuff in the middle of the aisles is all of this ultra processed food. And there's now
Hmm.
tremendous evidence about how dangerous that is. And, so that's the first place to start. And it's not necessarily that easy though. I mean,
Hmm.
when someone tries to cut sugar and processed flour out of their diet, they're often going to find that this is not as easy as it might sound.
Hmm.
And people might think like, oh, well, it's not a big deal. I can take it or leave it. But then I challenge you to, maybe for 30 days, avoid added sugars and process, any food that has added sugars in it. And that's also not that easy because they hide it in the labels and under
Hmm.
different names. But if someone, can try to do that for 30 days, they'll find that, it's not that easy to do.
Right.
Really just eating real whole foods, in place of those processed foods. So that's a place
If
to start. Yeah.
If a family did it for 30 days, if they were able to get, especially when I think about teenagers, if
Right.
my parents had told me that I couldn't eat certain things, I would just go eat them when I wasn't with them. So
Absolutely.
I don't know, it might be difficult to do this, but if they were to be able to, their teen could get off of sugar and or flour for 30 days, would they see the a change in that amount of time or would it need to be longer?
Usually people notice a change just in that amount of time. Uh,
Okay.
Now, it's not that you're going to get the full benefits in that amount of time. The
Sure.
longer you do it,
Sure.
the more benefits you get. But even
Yeah.
that amount of time will make a difference. And then if someone can add in some more aspects, if they're successful with that, then think about adding an exercise program if there's not any exercise going on. Even just starting with
Mhm.
walking. If someone's not moving their body at all, just going from zero to walking 30 minutes a day is an enormous benefit. And you can see that
Mhm.
within 30 days for sure. And then, if they're really getting into the diet stuff that I'm talking about, then, I would then advocate for even trying to drop carbohydrates even lower And then, ultimately, the most powerful dietary intervention for brain health is the ketogenic diet, which is a specialized diet and, does require some supervision and learning to figure out how to do appropriately. But
Hmm.
there's a long history of using the ketogenic diet in medical settings, going back to 1921 at the Mayo Clinic when they invented the diet to treat pediatric epilepsy, another
Mm.
brain condition.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Well, I have done keto before. I don't know that I was, followed it to the letter, but I did it pretty closely and
Yeah,
I did feel better. And I still do try to, I always call it like the 80-20, where I'm mostly doing it and then sometimes I have a piece of cake or something. But I do love it. It's of all the diets I've ever done in my life, which has been lots. I do like that one the best. I mean, it's one that I find easier to be on because the food I can eat, I like,
right.
and that it tastes good. And it's not, a cardboard, whatever, or some dry piece of something. I remember like other diets that I was on, like the food that I could eat, I was like, ugh. And I
Right,
could never stay on it because I hated it so bad. And
right.
keto was always the easiest one for me because the food tastes good.
It can, yeah. I mean, there are
Hmm.
versions of it that are absolutely delicious. In
Hmm.
our program, we have a chef actually making food, and it's amazing. Yeah.
Well, that's what I want to talk about that too. You have a residential program. Now, is it for all ages or is it for, what is
It,
this about and
yeah,
how do
it's for
people
it's
find
for
out?
adults. So we start
Okay.
at age 18.
Okay.
And it's for people who, really struggling with their mental health, and
Hmm.
really want to do this whole immersion in this whole metabolic approach. So
Hmm.
we have a dietitian there who's crafting an individualized ketogenic diet for people using whole foods. And generally, we recommend sort of an omnivore, meaning, animal proteins and animal products, but also lots of vegetables for
Hmm.
their benefits, which I strongly believe in as well. And very, and high and ketogenic diet for people who don't know is a diet that's high in fat, moderate in protein, and very, very low in carbohydrates. So it sort of flips the food pyramid a little bit upside down.
Hmm.
And what that does is it causes the body to make these things called ketones. And ketones are an alternative source of fuel for the brain, but they're also a signaling molecule to tell our bodies and our cells and our brains to do some very important things that end up becoming very, very good for mental health.
Hmm.
And so, it's a very powerful intervention. So at the program, they're getting that ketogenic diet. They get an exercise program, usually with a trainer, mindfulness groups where we're talking and teaching mindfulness practices, breathing, meditation, yoga, and then circadian rhythm alignment. So we're getting people up in the morning, seeing the sun in the morning, which is the most powerful way to set their circadian clock,
Hmm.
getting to bed early, reducing blue light before bed, really make sure people are getting that sleep rhythm in play. And then lots of measurements along the way. So we're measuring ketones, we're measuring glucose on a regular basis with a continuous glucose monitor, we're measuring mental health scales, and we're having, what I consider to be absolutely incredible outcomes with people with really significant mental health challenges, focusing on their metabolism to improve their brain health.
Wow, that is amazing. That just reminds me, I started listening to the book Drop Acid, which is about uric acid.
Yes.
And so, do you see that as part of kind of when people's uric acid is too high, they also have these health issues?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, uric acid's a little tricky. It doesn't correlate perfectly with brain health. I mean, I read
Hmm.
that book as well,
More maybe physical health.
but it does correlate with physical health in many
Hmm.
ways. And it correlates with metabolic health, but I don't think it's the most important thing to measure. The thing that we really are looking at in terms of metabolic health is this thing called insulin resistance.
Mm.
Or, so people have probably heard of insulin. Insulin is the hormone that gets produced by your pancreas when you eat carbohydrates and to some extent when you eat protein. And we're all becoming insulin resistant, which eventually leads to prediabetes and diabetes. About
Hmm.
50% of Americans are either have type 2 diabetes or are pre-diabetic at this point.
Hmm.
And if you add up
Hmm.
all the people who are insulin resistant, it ends up becoming most people based on the way
Yeah.
they're eating. And this is having a huge toll on our mental health.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time that these rates of obesity and diabetes are skyrocketing, our mental health, rates of anxiety and depression, as you and your listeners probably know, are also
Mm-hmm.
skyrocketing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because these things are tightly correlated. These are very much causing each other to happen.
Mm-hmm. Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah.
So in this residential program, do people have to live? I don't even remember what state you're in.
We're in Massachusetts, outside of
Okay.
Boston. Yeah.
Do people have to live in Massachusetts to be part of that or to have their insurance pay for it or things like that?
So it is a program that it was originally conceived as a residential program, and
Mm,
so we have some people coming and staying there. We do have people come from different states to be in our program. Unfortunately, insurance doesn't cover almost all of it because
mm,
insurance isn't interested in
sure.
covering residential mental health care mostly. They're also not interested in covering nutrition. They're not
Hmm.
interested in covering personal trainers, and so most of the stuff that we're
Yeah.
doing, they don't want to cover, unfortunately.
Hmm. Yeah.
So we now have some people come as a day client. They live nearby and they're coming for the day, having all their
Hmm.
meals with us. We are launching a coaching program as well, and there are some other national coaching dietitians and other coaches who are doing these types of treatments as well. There aren't that many yet. This is still pretty new, but
Hmm.
it exists out there, and we have some of those resources listed on our website. So if people go to our website, they can link to some other programs that exist around the country that are, some of them are online and things like that. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I'm definitely putting all your stuff in the show notes so people
Yeah.
can find you and find out more about this because it is fascinating. And I know a lot of parents that I work with, they're just desperate to find some answers. And I think this is another way that they can take some control over how can I help my child with their mental health because it feels like you're helpless. Well, I can't get into their head or I can't, make them not have these thoughts or feelings or whatever, but maybe you can
That's right.
by how you're feeding your family or what kinds of foods you're offering and making sure they're getting exercise and have good sleep hygiene and the things that can really help our mental health. They can really have a lot of control or at least help, control some of that, especially starting early. If their child never experienced eating a lot of McDonald's, they're not going to necessarily want to go to that all the time. So I want to
That's
make sure that my families have that information.
That's right. I mean, I think I'm glad you're picking up on that. It's one of the parts about this that I love is that it puts the power back in the hands of the individual and the family, as opposed to, you're relying on an expert doctor to come up with just the right medication or an expert therapist to come up with just the right therapy. And if somehow their therapy or their medication doesn't work for you, you get sort of labeled as treatment resistant. And
Hmm.
this is putting the power back in the hands of the individual that we can control our own health to a large degree. It's not easy. I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, just go and do it. It's super easy. If anyone who's done a ketogenic diet, Whole Foods version knows takes some work to learn how to do it, and
Hmm.
it's definitely more work, more cooking involved because you
Yeah.
can't just pick the food up at the takeout and expect it to be what you need.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, if you put that work in, you may have incredible results that you are desperate for. And so,
Yes.
yes, absolutely. And I think your point about starting young is also very, very important. So,
Hmm.
there's a study that I wanted to just make people aware of. This came out in 2021 in this journal, JAMA Psychiatry, and they were looking at over a long period of time metabolic health in kids and what it led to in terms of mental health outcomes in late adolescence and in their 20s. And they came up with some pretty incredible findings. So let me see if I can remember and get this right. So the kids who were the most insulin resistant, which is this thing that I was talking about, is sort of a sign of poor
Hmm.
metabolic health at age 9, at the highest quartile of them, most insulin resistant, were 3 times more likely than the others to end up having a severe mental illness like a psychotic disorder in their 20s.
Mm. Oh my goodness.
So metabolic health, at risk in youth leading to really bad mental health outcome. And
Hmm.
then the kids during puberty who gained the most weight during puberty ended up with a 5 times increased risk of depression in their late
Mm.
teens and early 20s. So, I mean, I'm not trying to scare people, but I am trying to make the point that metabolic health really, really matters. It's not this
Hmm.
separate thing. Like I'm just doing my thing when I'm eating, and then I go to the therapist and try to work on my mental health, where I'm really trying to
Hmm.
get people to connect these dots, that this
Yes.
all is one system. And the way you take care of your body through food and exercise and sleep will affect what's going on in your brain, and it will affect things like anxiety. And
Mhm.
we have control over those things.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, I think that the us feeling like we have agency is so important. And this is one of those ways that we totally have a way to form this and help this from the very beginning, if we want to do the work that it's going to take to do that. So I love that. Well, I'm so glad you were my guest today. I This is such important work to get out in the world. And if you find like a link to that study, I can always put that in the show notes too, so that the parents can look at that and see what they think about it as well.
Sure, I'll be happy to send it to you. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It was really a pleasure.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hmm.